Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My name is Muzzy the Poet, and today I'm going to be sharing with you a haiku I wrote. I had initially recorded an introduction to the video that you're about to see, but for some reason there was an issue with the audio and I lost the footage. So this is kind of like an intro, and then I'm going to be explaining what a haiku is, give you some background, and then share with you the haiku I wrote. So a haiku is a form of Japanese poetry that was popularized by Matsuo Bashao, and he came up with this structure which also has influence from traditional Chinese poetry, that has three lines, and each line has a number of syllables that you have to meet as the poet. So in total, there are 17 syllables we must achieve over three lines, and the syllable structure is five syllables in the first line, seven syllables in the second line, and five syllables again in the third line. You're probably wondering, well, what's the purpose of a haiku? Poetry, much like art, is something that's subjective. It's supposed to be personal to you, your truth. The purpose of a haiku is that you express a lot with very few words, which you could argue is what the purpose of poetry is anyway. But this is, I guess, the epitome or one of the peaks in the landscape of, literary forms that has mastered minimalism, in that you are, as the poet, in control of communicating what you feel, expressing that, but being very careful with what words you choose because you don't want to miscommunicate what you're trying to say or paint the opposite picture of the one you're envisioning whilst you're writing the haiku. And the practice I compare it to is when you're looking after a bonsai tree. Much like when you're looking after a bonsai tree, you have to be very careful with looking after it, its environment, where you cut its leaves to maintain its shape. Similarly, you have to be careful with the overall structure of the haiku, and then more specifically, the syllables per line and the choice of words. It commonly, the haiku itself, focuses on nature or moments of insight, which characteristically, when you look at the history of poetry, has always happened when a poet has been surrounded by nature or is reflecting on nature. So, Richard, for example, a lot of his poems um, uh, look at and explore the relationship between humans and their connection to nature as opposed to their connection with other people, right? Richard Wright was actually someone who wrote over 4,000 haiku and arguably mastered the haiku format. He was born in America, in Mississippi, and is known as, or would become known as, one of the most famous African American authors in the states. And he was alive sort of around the same time as the gentleman in the bottom right hand corner, Louis Alexander, who was alive or a notable figure during the Harlem Renaissance in New York. So when New York was a melting pot of culture and poetry and art, Lewis was one of the forerunners when it comes to writing and communicating using the haiku format. And the haiku doesn't have to rhyme. So one thing that I hear a lot, or when I've discussed poetry with people, is that poems have to rhyme. They don't. A haiku is one example of that. It doesn't have to rhyme. But some poets do choose to make the first and third line rhyme. And there are different rhyme schemes, but in a haiku, one form of rhyme that poets may choose to do or choose to engage in is by making the first and third line rhyme. Lewis writes, "My soul is the wind, dashing down fields of autumn. Oh, too swift to sing." So wind and sing are the first and third line rhyming. Autumn is the kigo, so the seasonal reference that connects the poem to nature, because, like we mentioned, a haiku is something that makes a seasonal reference to nature, or is related to nature. And the cutting word is the dashing. So the D and B sounds, or D and B sounds in general, are plosive or plosive letters. And the first line, comparatively, is something that is or has a lot of vowels. So my soul is the wind, dashing. Dashing clearly cuts the pace of the line when you're reading it compared to the first line. So that's the kiriji, to create a pause or emphasis, usually done to make the person think about either the first line or the second line. Similarly, Richard, who in a very vivid haiku says, "I am paying rent for the lice in my cold room and the moonlight too." So here, there's not a rhyme. I would argue there's a partial rhyme between cold room, moonlight too. So the room, moonlight, and two all have that double O sound, right? And cold, I would say, is the kiriji, so the cutting word. So I am paying rent, sort of all sort of monotone almost. for the lights in my cold room and the moonlight too. Rent, you could also argue, is perhaps the kirigi of the first line. The overall, there should be just one cutting word in a haiku. So now I'm going to share with you the haiku I wrote. So my haiku is called Burning Cold. West of Sham, life burns. Satellite with power tools. Cold blood in hot hearts. Thank you for listening.